Hello, this is Shanae Trudeau, and I'm joined by Bhavani Maki for another juicy conversation. Bhavani, it's so wonderful to be here with you.
Thanks, Shanae, for making the time and the effort. I really appreciate it.
Oh, are you kidding? I mean, you're the one that's in school. I'm just the stay-at-home mom.
That's that's an understatement.
Said very tongue-in-cheek. Yeah, it's amazing what we do as humans and mothers and parents and yeah, yeah. So I'm very excited for today's conversation. You spoke recently in one of your recent Sutra mentorship sessions about when you used to take people through an exercise of the entire decomposition of their body in Shavasana. And I was like, whoa, what? I got really excited and it's exhilarating for me. And there's some part of me that really craves this and I want this kind of yoga. I really want to go there. To me, it's a little unsettling. And I also get the sense that there are others who listen to our podcast and maybe haven't found the podcast yet, but people in our sphere who also want this kind of real, gritty, not polished, and they don't want the watered down version of yoga. They want the real deal. I want to know how we might get this kind of juice. If we can't always be near our teachers and mentors and or attend an intensive or training, save for maybe a few times a year.
Yes. Well, it wasn't something that I offered regularly. I will say it was kind of like there was the right moment, there was the right alchemy of people, and I knew there was a lot of risk involved. Because anytime we when we go into that threshold of our full decomposition in shavasana, um we feel both fear and exhilaration, and it has to be the right moment, it has to be the right group of people. um so it's not like something that I schedule, and honestly, it's like being there at the right time and the right place. And as I mentioned before, like there were certain practices that I used to share, like the Vari Saradauti, the drinking of the 3 gallons of salt water. And I realized that it wasn't appropriate for everyone. So through continued relationship, which, like you said, we can't always be there, we can't always sit together in the same space. Life and responsibilities and geography scatters us. But, there in this day and age, there are ways of maintaining that thread. And there's a progression that kind of happens, maybe not in a formalized, scheduled setting where, I might invite you into a more personal kind of shamanic ritual, which would have a different shape. Um, But really, when we think about it, it's like the tradition of yoga, it wasn't always about having your mentor hold your hand. And there was a lot of isolation involved, as far as like you were given something, you were given a root, which was then watered through your own practice. And then there were opportunities to connect with the teacher. I mean, very much it's interesting, bringing up this idea of like shavasana, because what we're exploring a lot now and in what I'm sharing is embryology. So it's kind of the reverse of that.
Mm.
So, even we may be looking for a particular offering or context. If you stay within the current, it's going to be imbued with that. Um, and really, it's about touching that threshold where we start to see how like spirit takes form and then releases that form. Um, and being in that space of curiosity, and it could be like studying the physiology, the anatomy, the science, very important is also what's being offered. and the container that's there. It's like I'm not holding your hand, but it takes us out of the performative aspect or even the thrill speaking aspect and kind of brings us out of the fog of spiritual amnesia so that we can connect with this mystery that's inside of us. So what I'm offering, in my presence is like a steadying atmosphere in which you start to open these deeper undercurrents within yourself and to know that there's safety, to know that you're not alone. I mean, even sharing that practice once, it becomes part of your field and your repertoire. And then certainly, I do offer like these catalytic kind of experiences. I try to do that definitely with the Yoga Sutra mentorship, the online school, and how that keeps these pathways open. I offer in different ways. And yeah, so it doesn't always come in the form that we expect it to. And it's not something that I can really schedule because a lot of people maybe like are craving it, but it's actually a place of just kind of like that spiritual materialism of just wanting to have this experience as opposed to it happens when it happens. It's not something that like, hey, I'm going to schedule a workshop on the decomposition of your body, but I will schedule, something about understanding your physiology. And then an interesting thing happens a lot of times when we go into these spiritualized kind of classrooms is that there's a disconnection from the embodiment. So that's like the art and the magic for me is like how it's woven into these experiences. And so I'm really grateful to those who know that like there's an alchemy and there's a magic and they show up and they're open to the ride without like, I mean, this is the big challenge is like, the expectation that you're going to dish this out. But knowing that it's possible, you know, certainly you can cultivate that space within yourself, and start to go there and know that, the juice is available in your curiosity and in your willing to go there, and that you really have everything you already need, and that the relationship that we foster together is creating that kind of a field of presence. So I hope that doesn't disappoint, but
No,
it's
it's
not like I even scheduled that in the moment. It was the right moment and you were either there or you weren't there,
yeah, which is all the more reason to just be there just in case.
I mean,
Yeah.
there's that possibility because there is that emergent, there is that magic, that's the fun of it, isn't it? It's like, as much as you design something, there's going to be something, there's a moment where something's called forth and then you get to create that together. Yeah.
Maybe I want to go back to something you just said in terms of this shift from Shavasana to embryology. So for those that might be new or just listening in, Shavasana means corpse pose, or Shiva's pose, and the repose of dormancy. And it just for me, I don't know if you have more to say about that, but I could ask that shift, from the corpse to the seed. Um, and I think it's really appropriate for where we're taking this conversation in yoga in terms of the biotensegrity and the real embodiment of it. So less performative and more feeling based.
Yeah. When we go into that place of real sensation, it doesn't become some kind of like orchestrated, even the teacher being performative, which I see a lot of, it's interesting too. as wisdom gets disseminated, to hear it repeated as like a campaign or a slogan to entice people to come in, and then but there's a feeling of kind of like there's like a little bit of hollowness behind it because it's coming from a hungry place. So what I really appreciate about the container is that, it's like Patanjali talks about it. It's a direct experience. And when we start to, really get curious about how these things unfold and fold into themselves and what is being revealed, and being okay with what's hidden, and knowing that like these are all seeds that are perennial. um that's the it's like it's that sense of the sagittal motion where we're so interested in achieving something or having done something. It's like on our, I went to Burning Man and I did a teacher training and I drank ayahuasca and I did this and I did that, versus it being this field that's happening within us. So yeah, it kind of requires there's a ripening process, and that's where I really appreciate having had my mentors who, you know, just kind of had weathered a few more storms than me and could hold that space for me with patience. And it's something that is like um it's an energetic it's an energetic of wanting to, of not being like really settled inside within it, and just being open to the experience again. It's that sense of like being hungry, like the ghost that has like the big mouth and the narrow neck that can't really take things in. So much of what is being transmitted is so much more than an exercise or um, the words or even the action, but is really intimated through a sense of presence and the space that we hold. So, yeah, when we return to that kind of sacred place of ritual and we cultivate intimacy with ourselves, with each other, with the process of inquiry, um, it starts to percolate into our system in layers. And that's where, like, just by coming together in the field, something really magical begins to happen. We connect dots in a different way. Yeah.
It's really potent. I'm saving my next two questions, but there's something that we're moving towards here that I just want to follow this thread. But doing these kinds of these spiritual practices in a group setting, words are really failing me right now. So there's like a lot of load on the word spirituality, and but I'm so curious because I have definitely felt that. And maybe I can tie this in with my next question. So, a lot in the spiritual leaning disciplines, there's a lot of tendency toward disassociation when it becomes a performative spiritual practice, and when often we negate our own inner voice for the group or the guru or the master. And but there is something that works in a group, and yeah, sorry, the question is not so clear now. I just kind of lumped that together, but um, we can talk about the tendency toward disassociation in the spiritual leaning disciplines when spiritual practice becomes performative, but also there's something that works in a group. There might be dysfunction, but something functional.
Yeah. I think when it's like that shine of showing up and being all excited and actually just being sitting in time and letting things take time and really kind of like, it's like Mircea Eliade, he speaks about, being a pundit on the Yoga Sutras and indigenous shamanism. It's about being able to get beyond these divisive concepts between the profane or the mundane and the spiritual. So oftentimes it's in those moments where it's like, okay, now it's hard, or now I'm bored, or I wanted to do this and we're doing that, that a lot of people, they get distracted, they get impatient, they get frustrated, and they leave. But this is where you're starting to really like get into these more nuanced layers. And this is often when people just kind of throw in the towel. So there's actually a lot of beauty in that, because in some ways those people really don't need to be there. They're not ready for it. They just kind of want to keep doing what they want to do. And so, they want to transform, they think they want to transcend, but being able to like be in that place of internal tension is where we start to connect with the raw honesty. And we really like to, have this idea of spirituality as being like this, ecstatic breakthrough experience, but it's actually being able to appreciate those nitty gritty, mundane moments and see that there's a lot of juice in those moments. So it's quite interesting. I mean, I actually have a young man visiting, a student, and he's really kind of like searching. He's like, oh, I'm studying all these things, but it just seems pointless. And I was, my husband and I were talking to him, and it's like, no, this isn't pointless. That's the point. But you're still in this process of, he's young, he's really young. He's just hitting his Saturn return. And it's like, trying to find the thing and doing all these different things, but not like really finding cohesiveness. But when there's that intention of like, okay, I'm a new hybrid, I'm something eclectic. And really, it's not just about me like feeding my craving for something, again, ecstatic or stellar or just like glittering, but to realize that like my spiritual practice is about being able to be of sacred usefulness and developing skills. I mean, Krishna says this in the Gita: yoga is skill in action. So, it actually, the yoga is in those moments of what we consider to be mundane, but being able to do it and know that, like, okay, all of these things are building momentum. And as much, not using spiritual practice as an escape from life, but actually being able to transform the seer and the way that we show up.
Amen.
Yeah, and this is where it's like, even, it's like that hungry ghost again. It's like you're always looking for, oh, what's the next big thing and the next big pose and the next, intense thing. And it's all of this outer motion, but it can feel numb on the inside. So really, yoga is here not to like evade reality, but to anchor us in reality and see that we're part of a bigger continuity. I mean, that's the magic of life, isn't it? Is like these situations, they coalesce, and then we realize like maybe we had to do something that was difficult, but it actually was a character building process. And suddenly we're like, oh my God, that's why I had to learn this. And this is why it relates to that. So, really being able to show up and really being able to recognize, okay, it's like I was talking to Sherry, who we had on the podcast, and she was saying she did this incredible class on Rumi's poetry and transpersonal psychology, and they would each pick a Rumi piece, and then it was read aloud, and they were asked to notice the moment they checked out. That's a really fertile place for us. And who are we to decide that something is mundane or not mundane? I mean, it's like as I go deeper and deeper into the embryology and our physiology and our anatomy and just the living intelligence that we are, it's like astounding how all of these things are working within synergy, and so it's like you really can't deviate, because this is the spiritualized ego. And sometimes it means you got to do shit that you don't want to do, or sit through something that seems tedious or boring or irrelevant. And that's where we're kind of like, we're leaning into the tradition and the mentors. I mean, can you imagine being a rishi and living in the forest? And there's a lot of trials and travails, and there's a lot of isolation, and you have to like motivate. And sometimes that motivation is to not make things happen, but to really open your eyes and open your heart. And you want to meditate on life and death, go sit in the forest, like
So this is really useful for me to hear. I just had my birthday this week, and yeah, and I was reflecting. I still am. I know that I'm so young. I just turned 38, and I'm like so young. I've always looked forward to birthdays, because I look forward to getting older, because I've always wanted to be taken seriously. And as a young, white, blonde-haired, blue-eyed female, I worked really hard to be taken seriously. And it happened when I turned 30. And I was like, okay, I really feel good about this. And I'm actually really excited about turning 40. But something that I'm just reflecting on, birthdays often do that for me, is like, what have I been doing with my life? And it's an important reminder for me that everything matters. So a lot of my 20s I spent just kind of, I feel like kind of schizophrenically trying things and like, oh, let's try this and let's try that. And I didn't really dive deep until much later. And I suppose that's just, age. And um, someone reflected back to me the other day, who she's a very skilled practitioner, but she comes to my yoga classes, and I feel so honored to have her in class. And she said, "Oh, you Scorpio nature, you." She said, "It's great to see you over the years, be tempered." And I was like, yeah, that's the importance of having community and having people that see us, because they can reflect back. Something that I don't often see is that, the usefulness of being tempered with age, with time, and then, like you're saying, like sitting with the mundane. It's not flashy or sexy or often always fun, but there's a utility in that.
well said. And I mean, from what I understand about the Scorpio, it's like Scorpio craves intensity, intense experience, but I imagine that you are in one of the most intense experiences of your life right now, which is like being a mother. There is an intensity and just like having your all of your life force focused on taking care of this little. And you can't really, like, the fact that you can schedule this is a miracle within the mundanity.
Yeah.
But there's something also, again, it's that sense of like there's fertile ground wherever you are. And um being able to enjoy these phases, but also being able to see that there's a longer arc, because in the end, what use is spirituality unless it is utilitarian, as you were saying? So, in real authentic spirituality, our body is the doorway. The world is the field in which we're working. It's not about drifting into fantasy or some revelatory experience that changes anything. And then, even then, when you have that experience, it's not about the experience, but about how you integrate it into your life. So, this is where like we get less fixated on spiritual performance and more about embodying this, and the satu dirga kala. It's like it's about a self-motivated, self-sustaining momentum that is generative within itself. And the inner settledness to be able to lean into that as well. you know um Again, there's just so much dysmorphia that's occurring through yoga, and it really, people tend to gravitate towards what aggravates their bodily humors already. you know um and so much about this looking for the affirmation on the outside, instead of being like, okay, I'm in this place of like wonderful, comfortable tension. And it's like we want it all at once. um but they're really, it's like John Kabat-Zinn says, can I be patient with this impatience?
Mhm.
Can I hold frustration within a bigger perspective and realize that like things are changing inside of me? Things take time, and to really, you know, lean into that mystery.
Beautifully said. And so before I get to the last question, again, there's two things I'm curious for yourself. I'd love to know your own experience in just this shift. I mean, it's been over many years, but in terms of dropping into this embodiment practice rather than trying to reach a peak pose. I mean, I remember years ago, you said, I let that go. I'm no longer trying to like do hard poses, and I really admire that. And so maybe there's something you want to share about there in that shift, and then also what you see for people, because you said it so well, is that we chase actually what aggravates us, but we lean towards that.
Yeah, spiritually, that doesn't include embodiment, becomes a form of distraction and of entertainment. And so, even though I'm not reaching for these poses that require, athletic manipulations of my body, it's not easy either, to really get out of my head, get out of my ideas. It's like we're unwinding 400 years of a mechanical understanding, where it's like, um, when you gave birth to your son, they didn't need to be like screwed together or bolted together. Like, he came in whole, and then he's in this process of expanding his field, his nervous system, his vocabulary, his capacity for communication. And then, as his feelings, as he's been able to voice his feelings, and as he starts to develop more relationships, the socialization aspect, and really kind of watching where, where, whether these are learned patterns or inherited or past life samskaras, we don't know. Watching how um there's kind of like favored posturing that happens, or how we go into a way of managing external pressures in the world. So it's really, really strong medicine. I mean, we're working on a like atom and anatomical, but atomical, on this deep layer of our DNA where we're unwinding these things within ourselves. And it requires a tremendous amount of presence, which is really not easy because immediately, like, the mind will want to wrap a dialogue around it instead of just like staying in that place of really kind of getting beyond this story that we keep telling, or the story of how it should be and what we're trying to fulfill. It's like we're really coming back to our native intelligence. So I mean, talk about like decomposition. You're decomposing, and it's so interesting because it's like it's so threaded within the sutra, and Rama really intimated that. It's like there's so much that's available to us within one posture, and then titrating that posture down to the most simple arthrokinetics, how our bones are moving, how our nervous system is moving, then shifting ourselves to, like, it's like you're panning in and you're panning out, and you're feeling this liquid matrix of your being, and then you're feeling into the holograph of like the larger implication of this web that you're a part of. I mean, these things are not easy to talk about. um it's a very internal process, and as we mentioned, I think a couple podcasts earlier, this is about pushing the frontier. But in some ways, maybe we're not pushing the frontier, but the frontier is, it's that sense of involution where it's the margins are rolling inwards, and it creates a different vibration in the person, which is ultimately what communicates without even words. It's like that story of the great master, and the students looking for the great master and looking, and he finally sits with the master, and the master just sits there with closed eyes, and the student says, "Thank you." Like, I get it, you know, I get it. Yeah. So, how we hold that space for what's already been within us to reveal, how we can get, our bodies, our nervous systems, our mind, like, there's the whole world is developing greater and greater technologies to feed this need for like the dopamine stimulation of all these like flashing lights and icons and buzz and whatever, as opposed to being able to like really drop into ourselves and see that there's a lot there that isn't packaged, can't be sold, can't even be talked about, but is something, it's like that awakening that happens within us.
Yeah. So my last question is about the voice and embodiment. I've noticed watching my son over the last year and a half of so much of him coming to land in his body is through his voice. It happened at birth when he cried, and a lot of sociologists and um, those people with big brains say that voice is for getting our needs met. But my experience is actually that he's calling out because it's like music, and I'm not sure. So I just wanted to open a conversation because I know you're a singer and you've used your voice in the past and in your previous life. You were in a band. But I actually have struggled with voice for a long time. And so I'm learning to embody my own voice. I spent a lot of years as a child not talking because of various reasons, but I'm doing okay now. And it's interesting that I have this profession that I'm a yoga teacher, so I do use my voice a lot, but I've been practicing singing um, and those kinds of things. And so I'm wondering what your experience is with embodiment and the voice.
What a rich question, or even reflection. And within our body, there's so much. There's like the unfinished story, or the story that is continuing to unfold through us, that is carried within us. And these stories and these words, they shape us. Um, and it's really about giving ourselves permission to feel, again, that sense of being able to go deep into that place of feeling. I mean, I can tell when somebody's talking like this, and for me, my journey began long before the yoga journey with actually we're kind of simultaneously, but it took a lot of years to realize the interface in which exploring my voice and exploring singing. And there was always, my father did a lot of singing. There was my mother sang to me. There's the song traditions around different different times of the year, and really feeling voice is really an extension of our breath, and feeling our body as a resonator, and being able even to feel into those things that maybe other people don't want to hear, or we didn't have the culture in which we could touch those things. So as again, through embodiment practices and somatics, we give ourselves permission to feel without wrapping the story around it. And there's that sense of when we're in that place and we're really willing to feel things within ourselves without giving it a name or a word, but to feel it as an energy, and to notice where maybe there's reticence around it, and to relax and be like, okay, this is part of being alive. This is part of, like, I have a whole repertoire of feelings available to me. Um, that permission to ourselves, it opens up space, and it allows us to take up space. And then we start to, like, when we speak, rather than it being coming from the surface, it starts to emerge from our center. And then these stories, they start to shape our voice. And some of us, our voice isn't always a spoken thing. Some of us are more in the touch, or the way that we're settled in a situation. Um, it's where we can even feel like, oh, wow, my diaphragm is holding, or I'm doing this paradoxical breathing where I'm holding these bandhas, and I'm actually not allowing my spine to move and my spine to lengthen, or I'm holding tension in my sternum. So then when we can, like, start to open up in that space without even knowing, like, oh, I'm going to say the perfect thing. And it's like, when that happens, I'm like, oh God, this is going to sound stale because it's rehearsed. But we trust and
Mm.
you do this, it's like you, you, you open in response in that moment, and the soul just kind of reveals and speaks.
Mm.
So we don't have to be a trained singer to access this. Voice is one of the ways that we express breath. When we allow ourselves to really feel into this inner spaciousness. um and then also, again, so much is expressed between the spaces of the words that we use. Definitely, integrating breath, noticing. So much of this, again, is the unlearning process in which we may not even realize, wow, it's like I'm holding myself up. I'm not receiving support. Or, okay, I'm going to imagine right now that I'm in a little elevator and I'm all squeezed up versus feeling like, okay, wow, I'm actually part of this bigger field that is moving through me. And Rama
Mm,
used to say that, it's like when you let go of being the doer and you let go of being performative or trying to grip or attain something, the expression moves through you.
mm,
Um, so, I think it's like feeling into your pelvic floor, um, tuning into the space around you, being in a bigger space, going outside, humming, noticing, excuse me. And some of this might even be like our listening capacity,
mm,
right? What part of me is listening to you? Am I listening to that part of my brain which wants to come up with like the perfect words that somebody could write down and then make a meme? Am I listening from my heart? Am I able to actually like listen to you from my core space? Um, Perhaps that's a big part of how our voice comes through is knowing our own presence and listening to that inner voice and holding it. Because even then, it's like, even when you express it to somebody, are they really going to get it? Or it's more like they're holding space for you, right? And it's like they're a resonator that is reflecting it back to you. So, I'm a big advocate for psychotherapy in that as well. But even then, a good psychotherapist eventually is going to give you the tools that's going to set you free and being in that space. And, you're an amazing writer. So that seems to be a really good um, vehicle for you. And what I see in you is like this radical presence. There's such depth in your presence. And if we go to the origin of the word radical, radix, it means to get to the root of things. So this is where there's like really there's an alive um transmission that's happening in the moment rather than that's something that's forced or practiced.
mm,
So definitely, like the pelvic floor breathing when we let go of ideas of like pulling up on the pelvic floor, when we just kind of like can tune into that internal resonance. The vagus nerve is wrapped around the pelvic floor. We're really shifting our physiology and we're feeling that sense of our wholeness again as a resonator.
mm,
So much of this is being able to like sit again in those quiet moments. And, it reminds me of that, the folklore wisdom of yoga is like, does something really need to be said? And even like giving the answer when the student isn't ready to receive it, right? If you let them ask the question, it's like they're getting affirmation. Does it need to be said by me right now? And allowing ourselves to be in that silence of sitting together. And it's like when you're in a resonant field, voice is not always something audible. And like Rumi said, right, does it need to be shouted? It's something that's already there. So, the pelvic floor is a wonderful place to explore that. The way we come into that is through a felt sensation in our breath. And, um, again, this idea of a sense of arrival. And it's a tricky thing for those who, like, their livelihood is around teaching this internal practice. Um, because we're trying to package things or consolidate things rather than be in that, like, that the continuous, the hard part of the ceremony, which is where you're just kind of like sitting and waiting. And it reminds me of this beautiful woman who's been part of like my learning community for a while, Macho Skanga, and she grew up, in the tribes. She's original peoples, and she said so much of it is like we travel to these ceremonies, and most of the ceremony you're just sitting there together. There isn't, it's like, this is very typical with indigenous peoples, like they'll travel far and they'll just sit together on the porch and there isn't a lot said, but it's in those still moments and then something is said, and it might not be some like, oh my god, this is profound wisdom, but when it's said, it's like there's a big container around it. um yeah, I admire that quality for someone who can really be quiet, and when they say something, it's kind of like sutric in form. It's concise. It doesn't explain everything or over explain it, but there's a lot of spaciousness in there in which it's like, oh wow, like something's here, and I'm paying attention, I'm sensing with my whole being. Yeah. But chanting that
Oh,
Om is so wonderful, right?
yeah.
It's funny, every time I do it, like the computer cuts out. It doesn't when I listen to the recording, but like really being able to feel that opening. The sound of Om
Mhm.
begins with the opening of the pelvic floor. And it also
Mhm.
begins with that sense of like the opening of creation. Like,
Mhm.
whoa, we can access it just by like feeling like, how big is the island? How big is the house? How big is the desert or wherever it is? That it's like, it's a big breath. It starts kind of with the in breath, right?
Yeah.
And then that pause, it potentially speaks about that. It's like really feeling into the pause would before the next incoming breath. And we were playing with that in the biotensegrity class, like how we wake up our back chain. And there's ways that we did that, with our body, so that we can really feel the back of the diaphragm expand. And then when we go to that exhale, without it being forced, like, oh, I should push out more. It's like there's always something that remains that didn't totally express. And maybe that's the seed, kind of like the little seed that regenerates. But in that place of like where you vacated what needed to be vacated, there's a little vacation in which this internal intelligence, which we might like, equate with brain centers or enteric brain centers, says, now it's time to
Mhm.
take in the next inhale. We're all in such a damn hurry, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's hard, isn't it? Because life requires like, oh my God, I didn't do this, I didn't do that. But like just that pause, that breath, I can feel my voice changing already.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
love from the beginning of yoga of a yoga class when we chant Om to the end when we chant the closing Om Shanti Shanti and just how I can hear everyone's tone, including my own. And I didn't really do much, especially when I'm teaching or if I have taken class. The resonance is so much more potent after we've done a little bit of embodiment.
That's such a beautiful reflection and recapitulation. And it makes me wonder also, not only are we less burdened, we're more open, we're kind of in that magic of synergy, but also how much better we're receiving it, right? Like the receptivity to how much are we hearing it, or are we vocalizing it because there's the receptivity to hear it as well. It's like this, that resonant field in which the wave is just self-supporting.
Oh, thank you so much. You've given us so much. You've given me so much to contemplate and work with and all of these practices. So thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, my pleasure. I mean, like yoga reveals, and it's this place of self-exposure and, you know, the tenderness in which we hold those places of intensity. And again, it's not about like busting yourself constantly, but just about like being able to drop into that space inside of you and knowing that like your voice will rise from there, the teachings will rise from there. And oftentimes, these moments that really like open a new layer to us, it's not something that's planned or scheduled. It's just like you were there, it's like the veil slipped a little bit and you got a little glimpse, and like, wow, who knew that was going to happen? The other day I was driving home and boom, a pueo, like an owl just flew in front of me. Like, I couldn't have orchestrated that. It was like, that was amazing. And
Mm.
I don't even have to wrap a story around it. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like that
Yeah.
in itself, I didn't have to make it magical. It already was. Yeah.
Mm. I'm so
Thank you.
grateful.
Thank you, Shanae, for these wonderful questions. And until next time,
Until
Ahui
next
Ho.
time. Thank you.